In Iran, the crisis is spiraling, the protests are swelling with calls for ousting the dictator, and the crackdown is intensifying, complete with an internet blackout.
Imagine you wake up and everything is blacked out. Your phone shows signal bars, but nothing loads. Messages do not send. Calls fail. Social media is gone. News sites do not open. You try to reach your friends, your relatives, your coworkers, and nothing comes back. You step outside and realize it is not just you. An entire country has gone dark at the same moment. This is exactly what happened inside Iran as of 7 p.m. local time, when the regime severed mobile data, home broadband, and digital communication nationwide. This was not a technical failure or an accident. This was the deliberate pulling of a switch, the kind that historically signals one thing only. The state is preparing to act, and it does not want witnesses.
Now, Iranian officials have cut off internet and phone service for the country in an attempt to curb protests, which escalated overnight.
History inside Iran has taught people to fear this silence more than noise. When the internet disappears, violence usually follows. The blackout is not about cables or servers. It is about isolation. It prevents families from warning each other, protesters from coordinating, and the outside world from seeing what happens next. It forces millions into a single narrative pipeline controlled by state television and official statements. In previous nationwide shutdowns, this same tactic was followed by mass arrests and lethal crackdowns, because when cameras go dark, accountability disappears. That memory hangs over the streets now. The calm that follows the blackout is not peace. It is the pause before impact. Something unexpected is happening beneath the silence. Even with the country digitally sealed, footage is still leaking out. Satellite connections, illegal terminals, and improvised links are punching holes through the blackout. What emerges from those gaps is not order, but fear on the side of the state. Images show security forces repositioning, armored vehicles moving into neighborhoods, and institutions meant for daily life being converted into forward bases. Schools are no longer schools. They are staging grounds. Campuses are filled with motorcycles, trucks, and personnel preparing for rapid deployment. This is not how a confident government behaves. This is how a regime acts when it expects confrontation. At the same time, journalists across Iran are being summoned and pressured to sign pledges restricting their coverage of protests. Those who refuse are reportedly threatened with arrest. This is the second layer of the blackout. First, remove the internet. Second, silence professional witnesses. Third, fill the vacuum with fear and misinformation.
Their hands are tied. They are under crippling sanctions because of their nuclear program, support for proxies, and more.
Citizens are also receiving direct intimidation messages on their phones, warning that membership in protest-related groups or the expression of opposition views may be treated as a criminal offense. This is not law enforcement aimed at preventing violence. This is political intimidation aimed at preventing presence. A government that threatens its population by text message has already lost moral authority. It is ruling by warning, not consent. The timing of all this is not accidental. Earlier, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi issued a direct appeal to Iran's armed and security forces, framing their position as a historic choice between standing with the people or enforcing repression. He also called on citizens to appear in public at 8 p.m. local time on January 8th, transforming a single hour into a national test. Roughly 1 hour before that moment, the internet was cut. The sequence tells its own story. The regime did not fear random unrest. It feared synchronization. It feared millions acting at the same time, watching each other, realizing they were not alone. That is why the blackout came first. What followed shows the scale of preparation. Reports and images describe security forces occupying school campuses, including Imam Ali High School, a location previously used during the 2022 protests after the death of Mahsa Amini. The same playbook is being reused. Schools sit inside residential areas, close to streets where crowds form. From there, units can surge outward quickly. This is a tactic designed for speed and shock. In parallel, footage obtained by Iran International shows individuals in hazmat-style suits and protective masks positioned on vehicles, marked with warning symbols associated with hazardous materials. Whether chemical agents are deployed or not, the symbolism alone is chilling. It signals readiness for escalation beyond conventional crowd control. As protests gained momentum, additional footage showed the use of shotguns against demonstrators and the deliberate separation of individuals from groups before they were beaten on camera. The imbalance is stark. On one side, organized units equipped with weapons, vehicles, and protective gear. On the other, civilians armed with little more than numbers and resolve. This contrast is not incidental. It is designed to intimidate, to fragment crowds psychologically before physical force is applied. And yet, despite the blackout, despite the threats, despite the visible preparation for violence, people still came out. Even under total digital isolation, clips continue to surface, likely transmitted through Starlink connections that are illegal but widespread enough to create pockets of visibility. The blackout failed to erase presence. It only made it harder to hide. Banners appeared declaring that the country cannot prosper under clerical rule. Acts of symbolic defiance spread, particularly among women, directly challenging the authority of the supreme leader. The regime tried to blind the country before 8 p.m. Instead, it revealed something far more dangerous to its survival: fear on one side and defiance on the other. What is unfolding beneath the blackout is not just a confrontation on the streets, but a fracture inside the state itself. While security forces are deployed outward, something quieter and more telling is happening inward. Reports have begun to surface that senior officials and members of influential reformist clans inside the government are quietly preparing exit options. According to information circulated by a major French daily, families of high-ranking Iranian officials have recently sought visas to France, not as tourists, but as contingencies. This includes figures connected to reformist circles who understand one brutal truth: when regimes feel threatened enough to cut off an entire nation's internet, they are also preparing for outcomes they can no longer control. Elites do not apply for refuge when they believe stability is guaranteed. This silent preparation reveals the third layer of panic. The leadership may project strength on television, but behind closed doors, calculations are being made about survival. In authoritarian systems, this moment is critical. When insiders begin hedging against collapse, loyalty erodes fast. Orders are still given, but belief in the system weakens. The result is a dangerous asymmetry: outward brutality paired with inward uncertainty. History shows that regimes rarely fall because crowds are brave alone. They fall when parts of the system stop believing the future belongs to them. At the same time, the state is attempting to buy time using a strategy that borders on desperation. A recent announcement from reformist-aligned figures proposed distributing the equivalent of roughly $7 per person per month to citizens, framed as economic relief. The timing could not be more revealing. This was not a long-term policy shift. It was an emergency bribe, offered as protests intensified. For many Iranians, this gesture landed not as relief, but as insult. In a country where inflation exceeds 40% and purchasing power erodes weekly, $7 spread across months does not address hardship. It highlights how detached the leadership has become from daily reality. The contrast becomes even sharper when placed against the regime's external spending. In the same year this offer was floated, the government reportedly transferred approximately $1 billion to Hezbollah. For protesters struggling to afford food, medicine, and rent, this disparity has become a rallying point. It is why chants have shifted decisively away from foreign slogans and toward a single demand: focus on Iran. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life for Iran, is not just a chant. It is a rejection of an entire governing philosophy that prioritizes ideological expansion over domestic survival. The economic backdrop explains why these protests refuse to fade. Iran's gross domestic product contracted in 2025, while inflation surged beyond 40%, with international financial institutions projecting similar levels into 2026. Unemployment is approaching 10%, and the national currency is in freefall. Iran exports oil, but it imports a significant portion of consumer goods. As the currency collapses, the cost of everyday life explodes. Just months ago, $1 could buy roughly 800,000 rials. Now that same dollar buys over 1.4 million rials, effectively turning anyone with foreign currency into a paper millionaire while ordinary wages become meaningless. This collapse is not abstract. It shows up in empty shelves, delayed medicine, and shrinking meals. As poverty deepens, official figures indicate that roughly 30% of Iranians now live below the poverty line, with that number rising month by month. This is not a temporary downturn, it is structural decay. And, layered on top of economic collapse, is a water crisis that many inside Iran openly describe as man-made. Years of mismanagement, dam projects, and diversion policies have drained rivers and reservoirs. Instead of acknowledging responsibility, officials have blamed foreign enemies for manipulating weather patterns and neighboring countries for diverting clouds. For a population facing empty taps and dry farmland, these explanations sound less like governance and more like surrender to fantasy. Against this backdrop, the blackout takes on a new meaning. It is not only about suppressing protest footage, it is about buying time while the contradictions pile up. A state that cannot stabilize its currency, cannot provide water, and cannot offer credible economic relief relies increasingly on force. That reliance accelerates decline. Security forces are visible everywhere now, but visibility cuts both ways. The more armored units occupy schools and streets, the clearer it becomes that the regime is no longer confident in its own legitimacy. And yet, despite all this pressure, people continue to appear. The blackout did not empty the streets. It changed the rules of engagement. Protests are harder to coordinate, but also harder to fully suppress because they are driven by accumulated grievance rather than a single trigger. The regime can shut down networks, but it cannot shut down memory. Every prior crackdown, every broken promise, every economic shock feeds the current moment. This is why appeals are now being made directly to soldiers and police, urging them to lay down arms and refuse orders to fire on citizens. Such appeals only surface when protesters believe cracks may already exist. The most dangerous phase for any authoritarian system is when it must choose between escalating violence and risking internal fracture. Iran is approaching that point now. The blackout, the intimidation messages, the conversion of schools into bases, and the quiet exit plans of elites are not signs of control. They are symptoms of a system bracing for impact, uncertain whether it can survive what comes next. What makes this moment especially volatile is that the regime is facing pressure from multiple directions at once, and none of them are slowing down. On the streets, protests are no longer driven by a single incident, but by a convergence of failures that have stacked year after year. Economic collapse, environmental mismanagement, political repression, and the sense of national humiliation have merged into one continuous grievance. This is why the state's usual tactic of waiting for demonstrations to exhaust themselves is failing. People are not protesting because of one decision that can be reversed. They are protesting because the system itself feels irreversible. When frustration reaches that level, time stops working in favor of the authorities. Inside the security apparatus, the stress is equally visible. Maintaining nationwide deployments is expensive, exhausting, and psychologically corrosive. Soldiers and police are being asked to enforce blackout conditions, intimidate civilians, and prepare for violent confrontation while watching their own families suffer from inflation and shortages. This is the contradiction at the heart of the regime's survival strategy. The same economic collapse that pushes citizens into the streets also erodes the morale of those ordered to suppress them. Loyalty enforced through fear works only as long as the enforcers believe the system will protect them in the end. When that belief weakens, hesitation appears, and hesitation is fatal to authoritarian control. The appeal issued by the Crown Prince directly targets this vulnerability. By framing the moment as a historical choice rather than a political demand, it shifts the question from obedience to legacy. Messages like this are dangerous for regimes because they introduce doubt into rigid hierarchies. They ask individuals in uniform to imagine a future beyond the current leadership and to consider how their actions will be remembered when power changes hands. Authoritarian systems rely on the assumption that the future will look like the present. When that assumption breaks, discipline begins to fray. Meanwhile, the regime's information strategy is showing signs of strain. State media continues to project calm and control, but the blackout itself undermines that message. If everything were under control, there would be no need to cut communication nationwide. Every citizen understands this instinctively. The act meant to project strength instead signals fear. Even those not participating in protests are forced to confront the implication that the leadership does not trust its own population with information. That realization alone shifts public psychology, turning passive dissatisfaction into quiet resentment. The continued appearance of footage despite the blackout further damages the regime's narrative. Each clip that escapes, each angle showing crowds still forming, becomes proof that control is incomplete. The authorities cannot fully seal the country, and people know it. This creates a feedback loop. The more the state tightens restrictions, the more symbolic acts of defiance multiply. Slogans become sharper, gestures become bolder. Participation becomes an act not just of protest, but of reclaiming agency in a system designed to strip it away. At the same time, economic signals continue to deteriorate. Currency volatility makes planning impossible for businesses and households alike. Prices change too fast for wages to keep up. Savings evaporate. For young people, the future feels closed. For older generations, the promise of stability that once justified endurance has vanished. When a society reaches the point where both youth and elders see no credible path forward, unrest becomes a baseline condition rather than an exception. The water crisis compounds this sense of abandonment. In many regions, access to clean and reliable water has become unpredictable, affecting agriculture, industry, and daily life. Farmers lose crops. Urban residents face rationing. Instead of addressing policy failures, officials deflect blame outward, invoking conspiracies about weather manipulation and foreign sabotage. These explanations may satisfy hardline supporters, but for those living with dry taps and dying fields, they deepen cynicism. A state that cannot manage water, the most basic resource, struggles to claim legitimacy. All of this converges on a single reality. The regime is running out of nonviolent tools. Economic concessions are too small to matter. Propaganda is losing credibility. Digital repression cannot fully contain physical presence. That leaves force as the primary remaining option. History suggests that when regimes reach this stage, outcomes diverge sharply. Either repression succeeds temporarily at a high human cost, or the act of repression accelerates internal fractures that bring about collapse sooner than expected. There is very little middle ground. The blackout, then, is not the climax of this story. It is the threshold. What follows depends not only on the size of the crowds, but on the decisions made inside barracks, command rooms, and government offices. Every order given and every order questioned now carries weight far beyond the moment. The streets are only one front. The real struggle is over belief, loyalty, and the future direction of the state itself. As the blackout tightened like a noose around the nation's communication, the response from the highest levels of power revealed a leadership not only under siege on the streets, but in psychological retreat. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, whose authority has long been the immovable center of Iran's revolutionary state, addressed the nation on state television, an address framed less as reassurance and more as defiance in the face of a crisis even the clerical establishment did not truly control. He accused those in the streets of trying to ruin their own streets to please the president of another country, tying internal dissent to external enemies in a bid to delegitimize the movement. Analysts describe this tactic not as strength, but as a last-ditch effort to coerce loyalty by inflaming nationalist sentiment at a time when it is rapidly diminishing within Iran itself. Yet the imagery spilling through despite the blackout painted a starkly different picture. Fires raged in multiple cities. Buses, cars, and motorbikes burned in what appeared from aerial footage to be pockets of urban warfare rather than routine protest. These scenes did not emerge from a muted crowd quietly asking for change. They emerged from a populace that, after years of repression and economic suffering, had clearly crossed a threshold, transforming from isolated protesters to a self-sustaining movement confronting power head-on. The scale of this unrest, despite digital isolation, was reported to be sweeping, stretching beyond the capital into provincial cities and even rural towns, touching all 31 provinces of Iran. This nationwide spread echoed some of the largest demonstrations in decades, drawing in groups from oil workers to students, from bazaar merchants to everyday citizens who had never before taken to the streets in political defiance. Words like "largest in years" were repeated in briefings by international outlets tracking the unrest, underscoring how deeply the initial economic grievances have evolved into broad political rejection. Behind the scenes of this unfolding storm, hard numbers tell a grim tale. Local human rights activists reported that at least 42 protesters had been killed and more than 2,000 detained since the first days of the demonstrations, up from earlier, more modest tallies that already alarmed observers. What began with shopkeepers frustrated by soaring prices and a plunging currency transformed rapidly into clashes marked by security forces opening fire and raiding hospitals to detain or intimidate those seeking refuge. And then there were reports emerging from specific cities of atrocities that many fear will become defining moments of this uprising. In certain locations outside of Tehran, social media accounts claimed mass killings at protests, where unarmed crowds were met not with tear gas, but with machine gun fire from mobile vehicles, leaving dozens dead in a single encounter. While verification remains difficult due to the blackout, these claims alone rippled through other cities, fueling fear and fury in equal measure, spreading defiance rather than submission. This brutal escalation has deep roots. Earlier in the movement, a young protester, barely 22 years old, was shot in the face by security forces and later died in the hospital. Her name and image circulated before the blackout, and she became a symbol for many Iranians of a generation that had watched earlier movements die under repression, only to rise again with a deeper resolve. Her death, and others like it in recent weeks, became rallying cries shouted across Tehran and beyond long before the Crown Prince's call for mass chants at 8 p.m. local time. This is more than economic revolt. Inflation topping 40%, a currency in freefall, joblessness stubbornly high, and a cost of living that outpaces every wage increase. All of these conditions have eroded patience and expanded protest membership far beyond the usual circles of activists. What many analysts describe as the unprecedented spread of dissent reflects not just spontaneous outrage, but deep structural dissatisfaction with a political order that has failed to deliver security, prosperity, or dignity to its people. The regime's response has been equally telling. Cutting internet access is not only a tactic of repression, it is an admission of vulnerability. Previous blackouts in 2019 and 2022 were paired with intense but shorter-lived crackdowns that ultimately quelled unrest. This time, authorities have gone further, disrupting telephone lines, limiting international calls, and even attempting to jam satellite internet services, all in an attempt to choke off every possible channel of communication before protesters could fully mobilize. Yet the blackout has not prevented crowds from chanting in defiance. Even as connectivity collapsed, broadcasts described people shouting slogans that called not just for bread and jobs, but for the end of the current political order, for replacement of the system that has ruled since the revolution nearly half a century ago. In some places, chants included explicit calls for the return of the monarchy, a taboo notion just months ago, punishable by death in earlier waves of unrest, signaling how far the psychological boundaries of dissent have shifted in a relatively short span of time.